Hey guys, Mr. Yisley here. So we are on to lesson number 9 in chapter 7, which is all about polynomial equations and factoring. And to this point, we've talked all about how to multiply polynomials to create different types of polynomials. Multiply binomials times binomials using the FOIL method. We've talked about how to multiply a binomial times a trinomial. Right? We've even talked about how to multiply monomial times another polynomial. We've done all of these things. We've talked about how to add polynomials and how to subtract them and how to combine like terms and all of those things. Well, now we're moving into the part of the chapter that I would consider to be like almost the opposite of what we were learning. Before we had these parentheses against parentheses and things like that, and now we're moving into where they've given us the final answer that we used to come up with, right? And they've worked it backwards and they want us to get back to the parentheses. And this process is known as factoring. We're taking out information that's the same in the polynomial and we're leaving what's left. So in this one, in this lesson, we're gonna focus specifically on factoring out the greatest common factor. Now, greatest common factor, we've talked about this before, but that is the number and also can be variables that they have the most in common, right? The highest number they have in common, as well as the amount of the variable they have in common, right, on that side. So to find the GCF, as we say it in short, greatest common factor of a polynomial, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to look at each term and we're going to say what's the biggest number that goes into both of them. That's where we start. Then we're going to say, all right, of the variable, how many is the most of that variable I can have? So like if I have x squared and x, what's the most? Well, I've got x to the second power and then x to the first power. So the most that both of them have would just be x. All right, and we'll talk about this and work through this. And what we're going to do with that is we're then going to list it out front, right? And then whatever we would multiply it by to get to is what's going to be left in the parentheses. This sounds a little bit complicated, but once you get into and see the examples, I think you'll be all right. So let's jump into example A then. So it says 4x to the fourth plus 24x to the third, right? So first thing we want to do is we want to list out, all right, the number that is the biggest number that goes into both 4 and 24. Well, the biggest number I know that goes into both 4 and 24 is 4. 4 goes into 4 and 4 goes into 24. So the 4 is going to be a part of my greatest common factor, all right? My greatest common factor is going to have 4 in it. Then I want to figure out what's the most amount of x's. And what I mean by that, right, is x to the fourth, we've talked about this before, really means x times x times x times x. All right, so 4 x's there. Right, that's really what x to the fourth means. We've talked about that with other terms like 2 to the third power means 2 times 2 times 2. All right, so if I've got 4 here in this first one, and I've got x to the third, that means x times x times x. What we're looking at is saying what's the most that we have in common between both of them. So I see that this one has 1, this one has 1, and this one has 1. So the most x's we have in common is 3 of them because the x to the third only has 3 x's. So this becomes x to the third. So our greatest common factor is 4x to the third. And again, the way we figured that out was the biggest number that went into both 4 and 24 was 4. And then the x's that they had in common was the greatest number of x's. Well, it was 1, 2, 3. So next thing that we want to pay attention to or we want to do, all right, is we want to put parentheses. Whatever our sign is here, we're going to list in the middle. Then we need to figure out, all right, well, what did I multiply 4x to the third by to end up at 4x to the fourth? Well, 4 times and what would I multiply 4 by to get to 4? Well, I'd only multiply it by 1. So really what I have is 1 right here. And then what would I multiply x to the third by to get to x to the fourth? Well, I would multiply x to the third by x, and that would make x to the fourth using the product of powers rule. So that means this is 1x, because that's the only thing missing from that. Well, then I do the same thing for the second term. What did I multiply 4 by to get to 24? Well, that is 6. 4 times 6 equals 24. Right? And then what did I multiply x to the third by to get to x to the third? Well, nothing, just a 1, right? X to the third is there, so 1x plus 6, or we could just write that as x plus 6. So when we factor out the greatest common factor, whatever is left is what is left in the parentheses. So 4x to the third times x plus 6 is our final answer. Now again, let's kind of work that backwards and make sure that that makes sense, because this is a little bit different. It's like the backwards of what we've been doing. We've seen stuff like this before, our final answer, so let's make sure that makes sense. So if I were to multiply this out, and again, this is my final answer to this problem, but if I were to multiply this out, I would say 4x to the third times x. Well, this doesn't have a coefficient listed, so it's really 1, and 4 times 1 is 4. And then x to the third times x, well, again, we would add their exponents. 3 plus 1 is 4, so we'd have 4x to the fourth. Then I'd multiply this one. 4x to the third times positive 6. Well, 4 times positive 6 is positive 24, and then x to the third is all that's left. So did we end up back where we started? 4x to the fourth. 24x to the third, we did, so this answer we had listed right here was correct. All right, so let's take a look at example B now. Same idea. All right, let's look at the numbers of each one of these terms and let's figure out what's the greatest common factor. Well, the greatest common factor of 12 and 3 is 3, because 3 goes into 12 and it goes into 3. So that's going to be out front here. Then again, what's the greatest amount of x's I see? Well, I have 3 x's here. I have 2 x's here. So the greatest amount that's in both of these is 2 x's. So I'm going to write x squared. So there's my greatest common factor. So now I'm going to put my parentheses. The plus sign that's here is going to go in the middle. And then I need to figure out, all right, well, what did I multiply 3 by to get to 12? Well, I multiplied 3 by 4. And what would I multiply x squared by to get to x to the third? Well, in order to do that, I would need one more x, so that would be 4x. Then same idea here. What would I multiply 3 by to get to 3? Well, that'd just be 1. And what would I multiply x squared by to get to x squared? Well, I don't need to multiply it by any more x's. So that would be our final answer. So 3x squared times 4x plus 1. And that would be our final answer right there. Now again, just to make sure that that makes sense, I'm going to show it to you again so you can see how it works in the backwards. But instead of doing it with the answer, I'm going to do it down here. So 3x squared times 4x plus 1. If we did this correctly when we factored out, we should end up with what we started with. So 3x squared times 4x, 3 times 4 is 12. X squared times x is, add the exponents, x to the third. And then 3x squared times positive 1, well 3 times 1 is positive 3. X squareds are the only x's, so bring those down. So did we end up with the same thing? 12x to the third, yes. Positive 3x squared, yes. So that was correct. So again, factoring is really just like the reverse of what we've been doing. And so I showed you what we've been doing, right? And we just had done the reverse to get to that. All right, well, I'd encourage you to try example C on your own, then check your answer with mine. So example C says 8y squared minus 24y. So the biggest number I know that goes into both 8 and 24 is 8 itself, so 8. Then I look at the y's. I have 2 y's here, but only 1 listed here because the exponent is 1. So that means the greatest amount that's in both is just 1 y. Because there's 2 here, but there's only 1 here. So I can't have 2 in this one, so I can only put 1 down. So then, again, I've got to figure out what did I multiply 8y by to get to each one of those numbers. So parentheses, the negative sign, come down. What did I multiply 8 by to get to 8? Well, that'd just be 1. And what did I multiply y by to get to y squared? Well, that would be another y. So I should have a y in here, or I could put 1y. It means the same thing. And then, same idea, what did I multiply 8 by to get to 24? That is a 3. Right? And what did I multiply y by to get to y? Well, nothing, because those are the same. So 8y parentheses y minus 3 is my final answer. Now again, if you're not ever sure if you got that correct, you could always go back and do the multiplication again, all right, to check it and make sure. But I know that this is correct, so we're going to move on to example D. All right, well, I'd encourage you to try this one on your own, then check your answer with mine. So again, start with the numbers 3 and 18. The biggest number I know that goes into both of those is 3. So I'm going to put 3 out front. What's the biggest or amount of x's in both? Well, this one has 2 x's, right? But this one only has 1, so I can only have 1 in my greatest common factor. Well, then again, parentheses, put my sign that's listed, which is a minus sign in between, and then figure out what we multiplied 3x by to get to 3x squared. Well, 3 would have been had to multiplied by 1 to get to 3. And then x would have had to been multiplied by another x to get to x squared. So I'm going to have an x right here. Then what did I multiply 3 by to get to 18? Well, 3 had to be multiplied by 6 to get to 18. Did I multiply any x's to get to x? Nope, because there's only one x here and only one x there. So that stays as just a 6. So 3x times x minus 6 would be our final answer. Now again, just a reminder, start with the coefficients, all right? Figure out what did you multiply by to get to that, or what's the biggest number that goes into both, excuse me, right? Then look at your variables and say, what's the most amount I have in both? Well, in this case, I only had 2. I had 1 x's here, so 1 x was the most I had in both of them. All right, well, if you have any additional questions, please let me know, but otherwise, you should have what you need to continue on to lesson number 10.